by us, the Imperial War Museum. It's privately owned. It's in the colours of, I think it's County of Warwick Squadron, I think it is. But this is the aircraft that was flown by the Poles during the Battle of Britain. Now, during the battle, which officially went from the 10th of July to the end of September, there were something like 66 squadrons of the RAF involved. And 19 of those were Spitfire squadrons, and something like 34 were Hurricane squadrons. So they did the heavy lifting, and then there were Blenheims, of course, doing their thing, and battles and that sort of thing. Now, of those the 34 odd Hurricane squadrons, 2 of those were formed during the Battle of Britain. That was numbers 302, who at one point in September, from about the 14th of September, were actually here at Duxford, part of the famous Big Wing commanded by Duxford, by Barder. That's his car apparently, so I'm told. And the other one was 303 Squadron that served at a place called Northolt. And they were 2 of, in total, 15 squadrons of the Polish Air Force that operated pretty much independently, although as part of the overall command and control of the RAF during World War II. And 10 of those were fighter squadrons, and there were 4 bomber squadrons, and this is like 300 Squadron, 301, 304 and 305. They were bombers, and then there was a reconnaissance squadron. And about, I think it's something like 1,904 Poles lost their lives serving with the RAF in World War II. And their memorials at Northolt. Has anyone been there? Northolt's sort of West London. It is in fact the only RAF fighter station, that was a fighter station during the battle, that still is a flying station. And I think the current occupants, it may have changed because the RAF's constantly evolving, but it was 32 Squadron, the Royal Squadron, where our BAE 146 came from. Okay, so that's Northolt. So that's really the spiritual home of the Poles. So they were here in the battle, they joined late on. Now, how did they get here? Because they didn't just get on a shuttle flight. So, very difficult. So Poland fell over the period from the 1st of September, when 1939 we're talking, when the Germans came in from the west, and if that wasn't bad enough, on the 17th of September, the Soviet Union came in. So they were being squeezed from both sides. And there's a number of myths about that period, how the Polish Air Force was destroyed in 3 days on the ground. Not true. They put up some fairly hefty resistance, and they dispersed their aircraft very carefully and cleverly. But it was tough. Obviously, they were fighting with a fairly outdated aircraft compared to the new monoplanes that were coming in, particularly the 109. So Poland fell, and the government evacuated as many of their armed forces as they could. All right, so that on their southern border is the country of Romania, which technically was neutral, and there was a sort of an understanding between Poland and Romania. Romania is important because there's a port, or there's a number of ports, onto the Black Sea, so you can get out. Obviously, you can't come across Europe. You've got to get out through the Black Sea and then through the Dardanelles, Beirut, and then come through the Med and up into France. So when they managed to evacuate out of Poland, they effectively had to become civilians when they were in Romania, and they were interned, a lot of them, but they managed to escape, most of them. That made it into Poland, and from there they would get to ports like Constanta, and then come out, as I say, through that route, through the Bosphorus, and then arriving in ports like Marseille. So that's the route that they took. And by June 1940, so it's a month or so before the start of the battle, there were about 8,300 Polish airmen that had assembled in Britain, which they called I'm going to try this. Wyspa Ostatnie Nadzieje. Any Poles here? Is that right? What does it mean?
Last Hope Island.
Thank you, sir. Yes, it does. It means the island of last hope, because if you think about it, it was, they've been chased out of their own country, gone through Romania, and then, coming into the Battle of France, and then, so when they assembled in France, because again there was an understanding with the French government that Polish squadrons could be stood up in Poland, that all kicked off on the 10th of May, the Battle of France, as we know. And the Polish airmen were largely overlooked in many ways by the French. They didn't know much about them, and neither did the British when they arrived over here. A bit of an unknown quantity. And I think the French thought they might be quite demoralised, so probably the exact opposite, in fact. Obviously, there's a language issue, so only about 10% of the available pilots, which represented about 74 pilots, fought in the Battle of France. And accounted for, estimates vary, but between sort of 52 and 56 German aircraft. Right, so this is the period, we're still in France at the moment, Battle of France. 25th of May, Dynamo, Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, and the Polish airmen are on the move again, and that's how they get out through ports like Bordeaux, Saint-Nazaire, and come out to England, which, as I say, it is Ostatnie Nadzieje, because they'd been pretty disappointed in France, because France had a huge army. They thought this was where they were going to stand and make a last stand, but sadly not. So they arrived in England. Now, initially, again, the RAF didn't know much about them, and the idea was that they were going to be commissioned as a volunteer reserve. They're going to be volunteer reserve pilots, and the officers would be given the lowest rank, pilot officer. Now, some of their more senior officers were a bit miffed about this, and wanted to have their own squadrons, wearing their own uniform, not taking sort of a specific allegiance to the king, but form their own squadrons, their own ground crew, commanded by their own folk, but under the whole umbrella of the RAF. And there were two Polish-Anglo agreements that were signed. One was on the 11th of June, and another on the 5th of August, that allowed for the creation of these independent Polish Air Force squadrons. And the first squadrons that were stood up were the bomber squadrons, 301 squadron, 300 squadron rather, 301. We're talking early July, 2nd of July. 302 squadron, 22nd of July, I believe, was established, not here, somewhere else. And 303 squadron was established on the 2nd of August. All right. Now, they're not made operational. Well, you all know that means as in combat ready. And the biggest reason was the whole dowding system of fighter control relied on what? Anyone? What was the key thing that it needed? Radios. All right, the whole thing needed radios because it was all controlled from Bentley Priory down through the groups, like 11th Group at Uxbridge, and so on, and then down to the sector stations like here at Duxford, all on VHF radio, and they're telling the pilots where to go. Now, if you cannot understand English, you're going to have a problem with that. So, initially, the priority was to teach English to a sufficient standard that they could understand these instructions. We're not talking about A-level English, just enough to understand the orders of the controllers. Secondly, the aircraft they'd been flying in Poland were very different to the aircraft I've got behind me. And typically, there are lots of types of aircraft. One of the aircraft that they were flying was a thing called a PZL-11, which looks like this. Now, some of you, just on looking at that, might be able to see there's some obvious differences between that and the aeroplane that's behind me? What are some obvious differences that you've noticed? Anybody? Wing. Okay, this is a high, on this aircraft here, the PZL-11, it's a high gull wing. And it's braced with struts. What about the gear, the undercarriage? It's fixed, isn't it? What about the cockpit? You can't really see it. It's open. Yeah. Okay, it's open. How many guns do you think this thing had? 2. How many does this have? 8. Right. So a big step up. Enclosed cockpit. Retractable undercarriage. Right. This was a very good aeroplane. When it came out, this was metal. It was a very good aeroplane. But it was very different to this. So clearly there would be some conversion training that was needed to get them up to speed on this. And of course, not all these aircraft here had a radio. Only some of the command aircraft had a radio, whereas all of these had a radio. So that was going to be important. Now they were pretty much itching to get stuck in. Now remember, these were very experienced pilots. They'd been to the academy at Deblin. Have I said that right? Deblin? Thank you. And spent maybe 3 years there. Hundreds of hours of training. For every hour they spent in the air, they were in the classroom doing the theory. I mean, these guys were really good. So of course they were frustrated at being stuck on the ground at Uxbridge on the parade square, cycling around on tricycles fitted with radios, practicing formation flying and using a radio. They were like, why are we doing this? I mean, we've done this. And they didn't think much of the RAF tactics either, because they'd had combat experience and most of the pilots in England in the RAF hadn't. So they were getting a bit fed up doing all this and wanted to get stuck in. But I can understand how the RAF were a little bit hesitant at first. Okay, so we're coming up to the end of August. Have you all seen the Battle of Britain film? Right, okay, so you know the repeat please scene? Yeah, where you got this squadron leader with a flight of training training pilots from a Polish squadron flying Hurricanes, and he's ordered to land, isn't he? Because there's a battle about to kick off, and the controller says, get those guys out of there because they're trainees, and issues the order, and of course the squadron leader says, right, steer 230, and then one of the Polish pilots spots the enemy and says, repeat please, and then peels off and goes after the Germans. And one by one they all do that. So repeat please, repeat, and just eventually there's just the British squadron leader on his own. So he's really got no choice but to go after them. And afterwards, back on the ground, they get a real strip torn off them for doing their own thing and shouting in Polish on the radio and all this. So they put that scene in because that's what happened, give or take. All right, on the 30th of August, there was a training flight from Norfolk under squadron leader Kellett, who was the CO, and this was in the area of St Albans, just north of London, and they were doing fighter affiliation with St Blenheims. Okay, in other words, practice attacks. And one of the pilots, who is a guy called Ludwig Paskewitz, spots some enemy and calls it in, because he's been taught how to do this, calls it in. Now, this is where nobody quite knows what happened. Either Kellett didn't hear it, didn't understand it, or just ignored it and carried on. So Paskewitz thought, to hell with this, and he broke off and he attacked what he thought was a Dornier 17. Turned out it was a Mesh 110. So good gun, he shot it down. He said it was one of the easiest things he'd done. So he got 8 guns on this as opposed to 2 in his PZL. And he got back and he got a strip torn off him, and but also congratulated by Kellett, saying, well done, you've scored 303 Squadron's first victory. And the next day he got onto group, said these guys need to be committed, and they went operational from the 31st. Now the 302 Squadron had been made operational a bit earlier, from the 15th of August. All right, so not here, as I say, they were somewhere else. I can't remember where they were, but they did come here, as I say, around the 14th of August, from part of this big wing of squadrons that we had here at Duxford. 3 squadrons of Hurricanes. There was Barder's Bus Company, 242 Squadron, which was a Canadian. 302 who were Polish. 310, let's not forget about the Czechs, because there were 88 of them who fought in the battle, so they were here, 310, and then we had 19, so our Spitfires in the markings of 19 with the QV codes. They were here as a resident, if you like, lodger, although they were moved down the road to Falmere after a while to make room, and then later 611, I think it was. So they were part of that. 303, as I say, were in Norfolk, which is right on the, to the north, of the most northerly of those those bases that ring London, like Kenley and Croydon and North Wales and Biggin. Okay, so they had a little bit more time to get altitude, and we probably gave them an advantage. So that was the start of the battle. So they came in late and then fought all through the toughest part of the battle, really, September, and then the battle, and they wound down until the end of, I think October was when it officially was over. Right. 303 Squadron were withdrawn from the battle area, the combat area, around the 11th of October, after something like 42 days non-stop in combat. I don't know I can't imagine what that's like. It must have been absolutely on their chin straps. And they were withdrawn to Leckensfield, and likewise 302, because Dowding skillfully rotated his pilots. Okay, so that's a few stats then. How many pilots do we think we're talking about? Polish pilots took part in the battle. Anybody got like to have a guess? 145. Okay, 145. Not very many. All right, so 5% of the pilots that took part in the battle. It's about 2,970. About 5%. Okay, but they accounted for 7.5% of all the victories. All right, so there were 145 pilots. Not all with 302 and 303 Squadron. A lot were sent out to individual squadrons of the RAF. One such pilot was Anthony Glavacki. He was sent to 501 Squadron, one of the auxiliary squadrons, County of Gloucester Squadron, and he was one of 3 ace-in-a-day pilots. So to be an ace, you needed to shoot down 5 enemy aircraft. And he did that in one day in 3 separate sorties, Anthony Glavacki. So he was one of many aces that the Polish pilots produced. 302 Squadron claimed 18. Now, claiming was very, very, it's contentious, all right? And these claims have been revised over the years. 18, sort of, if you look it up, that's what it'll say. And the number of probables and whatnot, okay? 303 racked up this crazy score of 126 aircraft, right, in 42 days. That subsequently has been a little bit revised, but it's still proportionally, but all the squadron claims were revised, but proportionally it's still a huge percentage. Okay, so they really did punch above their weight. Well, now the question I was asked is, should we be surprised? Not really. They were extremely well trained, as I said, at Deblin, and if you think about it, the good pilots survived the battles in Poland and the battles in France. So it's kind of like survival of natural selection. The best pilots made it to England. And these guys were a little bit older, certainly wiser probably, and were battle hardened. They were skilled at gunnery. Right? They knew what they were doing. I mean, fighting a PZL, you had to use that aircraft to the best advantage against. You could turn tightly because it's flying more slowly, so you've got a smaller turn radius. So they were very, very skilled. And of course they had this hatred for their enemy that probably wasn't there yet among the RAF pilots, because we hadn't been invaded yet, so we weren't invaded, So And of course they'd been chased out of two countries. So they had this edge, good gunnery skills, and you can put all that together. And stories of the recklessness are just nonsense, because their loss rates were about a third or something of the RAF. They were a bit impatient didn't suffer fools gladly, but I'm very glad they were there. 29 were killed out of that 145, but of course they went on to serve right through until the end of the war, and after that what happened was awful, really, because they didn't have a country to go home to. It was just given away. They weren't allowed to be on the victory parade. They were excluded for political reasons. Awful. I can't believe we did that. We did. I think an invitation was put out at the end, but they sort of know if that's the way you feel about it. It's horrible. And then thankfully, obviously, after 1990, got the country back. But there we go. So that's a little bit about the Polish airmen. Later on, I'm going to be doing another talk about Josef František, who was actually a Czech pilot who flew with 303 Squadron and was ended up as one of the highest scoring aces to the battle. A little bit of a maverick. He's got an interesting story. But I'm going to leave it at that. That's enough for the time being. Anybody got any questions at all? around here forever. So we need to train up the next generation.
So do you know what all these aeroplanes are?
Do you know which one is the Spitfire?
What did you say?
Well, yeah, I mean, what the I think it's one of his guys, like the AHS, he designed that. It's just the sickness. The she's going upright, 1876.
used to this snake though, because normally these airplanes are blocked.